Okay, welcome everyone. I hope that you're having a nice morning or afternoon or evening, whatever time it might be for you in your time zone. I'm live streaming here from Italy where it's the afternoon. So if there's anyone else from Europe, then it's also excellent that you're joining a live stream at this time in the middle of the day. And hello to some of the people who have also made greetings in the chat. I see from Jay Kim, hello, and Monal, and Uttara, as well as Sean. So hello to all of you. Some of you in the US who I haven't seen in a while. I hope that things are going well also at Empty Cloud Monastery. And so today we'll be looking at the same theme that we were looking at last time, because we had a lot of suttas to go through, and because the theme is so broad, I think that it warrants looking at it in more detail than just a single session. And really, the Buddha in the suttas that we're looking at, which for those of you who weren't at the previous live stream that I did, these are suttas that deal with what's sometimes called dependent liberation, or in essence, the gradual process that leads to awakening, that leads to freedom from suffering and samsara, the cycle of rebirth and death, and the freedom from the defilements. It leads to peace and joy and happiness. And so all the good qualities that we might be looking for and the different goals that we might have in the spiritual practice, the Buddha says that these come about from a natural sequence of causes and effects. And so we're looking at some of the discourses that the Buddha gives that deal with those causes and effects. And so as I was saying, because this topic is so broad, and because really this is all we kind of need to know, this is what the Buddha is saying leads to awakening, then I think it warrants, considering this for some time. So if there's any sutta that sticks out to you today, or any particular, even just a small aspect of the suttas that sticks out, I recommend that you remember it, and that you recollect it, and that you examine it in your experience for a prolonged period of time, because that can have a lot of benefits. And that's one of the things that we'll actually talk about today, how that works in the path to meditation. So now that we've had a little introduction and some more people are coming in, I think we can go ahead and get started with the formal Dhamma talk and the teaching. And everyone, please remember that you're welcome to leave any questions that you might have, or comments, or things that you think would be good to look in a little bit more detail, or if you felt that something was rushed over or not addressed enough and you'd like it to be clarified. Anything like that, please feel free to leave that in the comments. And then if there's time at the end, we'll go ahead and look at those and discuss them together. So this time we can render homage to the Buddha with the traditional Namo Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namassami. Okay, and also greetings to the others who are joining in online and leaving remarks, Maria, Gregory, and Yankee. Good to see you also. Okay, so last time, just as a little bit of a review, in specific, last time what we looked at was a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, AN Anguttara Nikaya 10.62, which is very similar to 10.61. Those are both suttas in the collection that's organized by numbers. So in the Buddhist scriptures, in the Anguttara Nikaya, you have these two suttas, and they deal with how the process to awakening from the very beginning, so from the very first point when you hear the teachings, or if you don't hear the teachings, the process to remain in non-awakening, from that very first point of either hearing or not hearing the teachings, how that can kind of branch out and then lead to either freedom if it is pursued properly, or it can continue perpetuating the cycle of suffering if it's not actually developed. And what we looked in there, the essence of that teaching was that essentially each factor that we develop, say the starting factor, that factor then, when it's fulfilled, it naturally produces the following factor. And the simile that the Buddha gave of that was like when it rains on the top of a mountain, and then the rain, it naturally flows down the mountain, and then it starts filling up little creeks and crevices, and then those naturally fill up with water, and they start flowing down. And eventually you get things like rivers and streams and all the way up to filling the ocean. So what the Buddha was stressing there is that when the rain falls on the mountain, it doesn't actually need to do anything. As long as the path of the water is not obstructed, the rain will just naturally start filling up, and it will eventually go to the ocean. It's not something that has to be forced, right? And actually, if you try to force it, then it will make it very frustrating. And we talked about that when the Buddha gives his traditionally called second sermon, the second formal teaching, where he taught the discourse on non-self. And what we talked about there was how the Buddha says that we can't actually control our body or our mind by a mere act of will, right? Just by an act of will, we can't make things either change, and we can't make things go away, or we can't make things come into being. So our acts of just by simply wishing for something, or hoping for it, or forcing really hard and trying really hard on our mind to make it happen, that alone isn't enough to change how our life works, right? And so what we talked about was actually that can really be an obstacle, right? When we're trying to do that, because the Buddha says it's impossible, then it becomes frustrating. But if we understand the proper sequence of causes and effects, then all we have to do is we actually just look, okay, what are the causes that are missing? If our practice is not progressing, right, we just look, okay, then what are the causes that are missing? And then how can I develop those so that they naturally move forward? And that's what we were looking at last time. And one of the things that we talked about in a little bit more detail was how the Buddha says that by practicing sense restraint, right, by restraining our senses, by not allowing our mind to leak out and react with desire and greediness, discontent, or to leak out with aversion, hatred, resistance, ill will. When the mind is not leaking out like that in response to our sense experience, like the things that we see and hear and so on, he says that then that naturally leads to purity of conduct, right? Because then you don't actually have the underlying cause of impure, immoral conduct, right? Because you have restrained the strong desires and the strong aversion, then you just don't act out of those things. And then the Buddha says, well, when you're just not acting out of desire and aversion on a course level, then naturally the meditation starts happening, and then naturally it leads on to awakening. And so we talked about especially that kind of key point of sense restraint. And the other key little node, you could say, on this sequence there is the one of associating with good people and hearing the good Dhamma, hearing the right teachings, right? Because that's where the Buddha actually starts it. And so the Buddha said there that when you associate with the right people, when you associate with people who are Dhamma practitioners or people who are experienced in the Dhamma, then you get the opportunity to actually hear the true teachings. And because you hear the true teachings, then you actually gain faith in them and you apply them. And that's what allows you to then practice sense restraint, practice the virtue, develop the Noble Eightfold Path, right? Develop the meditation, and eventually attain awakening. So it's actually the learning the Dhamma from someone else, which is the seed that then naturally brings you forward along the path. So those were the kind of some of the main topics that we talked about. And so today we're just going to look at some of the aspects of this that we didn't get to look at in as much detail. And so one of the things that I think would be helpful that I referenced last time, we talked a little bit about the 7 awakening factors. And the 7 awakening factors, as I said, are, or as some of you may already know, actually, they are a list of 7 qualities, spiritual qualities, that are necessary to lead the mind to be able to release the suffering and the defilements that keep it in samsara, right? Or essentially that allow the mind to attain awakening, attain what the Buddha calls vidya vimutti, which means knowledge, or insight, and freedom, right? So to attain awakening and then freedom from samsara, the two main goals of the path. The 7 awakening factors, the 7 factors that lead to awakening, right? These are these particular spiritual qualities. And these are not necessarily something that happens in a sequence, because there are places where the Buddha says, for example, oh, some of the 7 awakening factors are helpful when you're sleepy or dull, and other awakening factors are helpful when you're restless. So sometimes it's not just a matter of linear factors, right? Sometimes you might actually mix and match depending on the state of your mind at the time. But there are suttas where the Buddha does indicate that the 7 awakening factors are linear, that they progress in a sequence. In the same way that the simile of the rain going down the mountain, how that is a sequence, right? The rain doesn't fall in the mountain and then immediately go in the ocean, right? It has to go through a series of steps. So in the same way, there is a similar explanation of the awakening factors. And it actually mirrors the sutta that we looked at last time. So I think that this will be useful to at least start. And this is Samyutta Nikaya 46.3. So I'll put the name of that in the chat. And the link of this should be available in the description of the video if you would like to read that on Sutta Central. And I'll be reading from Bhante Sujato's translation, possibly making some adjustments or comments as we go along. And this is just to get an idea of these awakening factors and how they relate to what we've talked about. So the Buddha says, mendicants. When a mendicant is accomplished in ethics, samadhi, knowledge, freedom, or the knowledge and vision of freedom, even the sight of them is very helpful, I say. Even to hear them, to approach them, to pay homage to them, to recollect them, or to go forth following them is very helpful, I say. Why is that? Because after hearing the teaching of such mendicants, a mendicant will live withdrawn in both body and mind as they recollect and think about that teaching. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of mindfulness. They develop it and perfect it. And then we'll pause here. So here the Buddha says something similar to the previous one that we looked at, where he says, okay, when you have here the word mendicant, for those who aren't as familiar, it is a word it's a translation of bhikkhu, which means a Buddhist monk. So literally it means mendicant, a religious person who receives alms food, receives offerings that are given by others, right? So when he says mendicant, it's referring to monks of any gender. So he says, when a mendicant is accomplished in ethics, that's the sila, samadhi, that's meditation, deep meditation, as well as knowledge, freedom, or the knowledge and vision of freedom. So what he's saying here is when you have monastics who are very developed, right, who they have virtue and they have good meditation and they have wisdom and they have some degree of freedom and so on. So monastics who have those qualities, the Buddha says even just to see them is very helpful. And even just to hear them speak, right? Even to just approach them, just to be near to them, or to pay homage to them, right? To bow to them, even just to recollect them, just to remember being around them, or to go forth with them. So to ordain under them, to become a monk as their disciple is very helpful. And he says, why is it helpful? He says, because you'll hear, they're going to teach you the Dhamma. Those people, those monks, those mendicants, they will teach you the Dhamma. And then once you've heard it and learned it, you'll go off and you'll be withdrawn in your body and your mind, and you'll recollect and think about it. And he says that at that time, you're actually developing the factor of mindfulness, which is the first awakening factor. And this is interesting if some of us are more used to the modern understandings of mindfulness in certain secular circles, right? Because sometimes mindfulness is presented or taught as just the awareness in the present moment, just like a non-judgmental awareness in the present moment, right? I think that's even it's like a standard definition of mindfulness in some more clinical or secular settings. And mindfulness in the present moment definitely is important in Buddhism. It's not to say that we shouldn't be developing clear awareness in the present moment, But that's not the only thing that mindfulness is, right? Mindfulness has other factors too in the context of the Buddha's teachings. So when the Buddha talks about mindfulness, it's not just a single thing like just non-judgmental awareness in the present. And this is an example where he says that. So he's actually saying, when you are remembering the teachings that some inspiring teacher has given you, you are practicing mindfulness. And then you develop it and you perfect it. So you it's not just that you do it once, but you develop it, it's something that you gradually build up, and it gradually matures and develops. And it comes because you've heard the teachings from inspiring people. In the same way that in the other suttas that we've looked at last time, if you were there, the Buddha said that it's by hearing the Dhamma that actually leads you to practicing the Dhamma, right? It leads you to reflecting in line with the Dhamma, and then it leads you to being mindful and aware of yourself in terms of the Dhamma, and then it leads you to practicing sense restraint and virtue and meditation. So it's kind of the same principle, it's just explained in a little bit of a different context. But here the Buddha is saying, okay, you hear the teachings and then you remember them, and that is your mindfulness. And this is also related to the literal meaning or the etymology of the word sati, which is usually translated as mindfulness. If any of you know Sanskrit or other Indian languages that are related, then you might be familiar with the word smriti, right? Smriti means mindfulness. It's the same word, it's just the Sanskrit version. But it also means memory, right? So smriti also means memory. And in the same way, because it's the same word, sati also means memory. So here you can see that really coming out. The Buddha is saying that when you're remembering the teachings, you're practicing smriti or sati, you're practicing memory, right? You're practicing mindfulness. But the meaning of memory here is not like you're reminiscing about long gone days of the past, of your childhood that you miss and that you're disappointed is no longer here, right? That's not the type of memory that we're talking about. And it's also not the memory of just a list of facts. Like you're not just remembering, for example, oh, on March 3rd of 2007, this happened and that happened, right? So it's not just it's not nostalgia, nor is it just remembering information, but it's more remembering spiritual qualities and teachings, right? It's more of an emotional thing, and that's why it leads to meditation. So, like, for example, let's say that you heard teachings about loving kindness. Say that there is an inspiring teacher, and you went to them and they told you how to practice loving kindness, and they told you how to be remove anger and remove resentment, and they told you that you can do certain practices like reflecting on the drawbacks of anger, and you can recite certain phrases and have certain associations in your mind, and that will help you develop kindness. So then when you go off and you're alone, like let's say you see this teacher, and then you go off and you practice in your room quietly, and you remember what they told you, right? You remember, oh, okay, so maybe I'll remember some kind people in my life, and I'll think kind thoughts, and then I'll try to expand that feeling to others. So you see how just by hearing that teaching, then when you go off on your own, you can try to put it into practice. But you have to remember it, right? If you forget what they told you, then you won't actually be able to practice the Dhamma. And so it's kind of like remembering the instructions, right? Is really what it's talking about here. If you don't know what to do, then you won't be able to do it. And one modern example of this would be guided meditation. So guided meditation, where you're listening to the voice of the speaker and you're following their instructions, that's almost like a real-time example of this thing. So imagine if you received guided meditation, but then you went off on your own and you practiced it quietly by yourself, right? You would have to remember the instructions and call them into your mind and kind of try to get in the feel of that and get in the zone and match up your meditation with those instructions. So that's the factor of mindfulness here, right? It's recalling those instructions in an appropriate way, which is helpful to develop spiritual qualities. So that's what is meant by memory in terms of mindfulness. And that's how memory comes from associating with inspiring teachers, right? And so the Buddha says, okay, you develop mindfulness because you've heard the Dhamma, because you've associated with good people, right? Maybe one other quick note to put here is that, and this came up in a discussion recently, is that nowadays you might have people who read the Dhamma, or they are exposed to it not through the living example or the example of teachers and actual people, but they are exposed to the Dhamma, just say from books or from reading in the Sutta Central website, for example, right? Something like that. And so there is learning the Dhamma, but there's not the same association with actual people. And I mentioned last time that the Buddha says that you have to associate with people because in his time, of course, there were no really Dhamma books that you could read. You would have to learn the Dhamma from a human, right? From an actual teacher. But I do think it is relevant and important to mention that it is beneficial to actually associate with people if it's possible, right? Because this is what the Buddha says here. He says, even just to see them, even the sight of them is very helpful, right? And he says, even just to hear them, just to approach them or pay homage to them. So even just something like seeing an inspiring practitioner, even just bowing to them or making an offering is very helpful, because even if you don't hear very detailed teachings, even just the encounter with an inspiring person can actually be something that you can remember with mindfulness. And that can actually lead you to developing those qualities, right? So like, even if someone doesn't teach you how to develop metta meditation, well, if you're around someone who has a lot of metta, then even just being around them is already helpful, because then when you go off on your own, you already have a little bit of a reference point to kind of understand what metta is, right? And you have something to compare, like, oh, what is my mind like, and compared to what their mind appeared as on the outside, right, with their conduct. So it's not just the words or the instructions, but it's also those examples, because those examples can leave imprints on the mind. And this is something also that you see in the suttas, where some people, they just hear the word Buddha and they become inspired and they have faith and they become joyful, because they just, even just hearing the word of a person who has attained awakening and who is pure is already so uplifting to them, right? And in the same way, you might have similar examples like that in your own life, right? Even just being around certain people in your life, or even just hearing that there are people doing things, right? Like maybe just to know the fact, just to know that there are people practicing the Dhamma, right? That there are people developing meditation and virtue. Just to know that and just to remember that is already something that can be uplifting and inspiring. So that's a practical teaching also, that we can remember when you're practicing meditation or when you're on your own, can you recollect inspiring encounters, inspiring examples, inspiring teachings, useful phrases or useful techniques or useful attitudes that you've learned, either through words or through just seeing or hearing? Can you recollect that and try to bring it up into your mind and inspire your heart with that and develop that, right? And then you're developing mindfulness. So that's something practical, and you can see how that's a natural cause and effect. And then the other aspect of mindfulness here, the other aspect of memory, which I apologize if I'm referring to the previous live stream a lot and some of you weren't there, but you don't worry, you don't have to have heard it to understand this. But the other thing I mentioned in the previous live stream is that when you've heard the teachings, then actually you can't really help but remember them, right? I heard a story, an anecdote of someone who was approaching, they were staying, what's the word? They were attending Dhamma services, attending Dhamma events like meditations and Dhamma talks. And then they were gone for a while and they weren't attending. And apparently they came back and they said to the teacher that they tried to leave. Like they heard the Dhamma teachings and they just wanted to forget that and ignore it. And so they tried to just avoid it and they stopped going. But they said at a certain point, they just couldn't help it. They couldn't get the Dhamma out of their mind and they couldn't stop remembering it and remembering the difference between practicing the Dhamma and not. And so they were forced to go back. It was almost like they wanted to not practice the Dhamma, but when they tried, it just didn't work because they had already heard the teachings and they had already had a certain impact on their mind. So yeah, in a similar way, like once you've heard these teachings, you can kind of try to avoid them, but eventually they're just going to come back. And I think for most of us, we aren't trying to avoid them, right? I think most of us who are, if you're listening to this live stream, then you're actively trying to practice the Dhamma. So even more so, well, you just naturally remember the teachings. You don't really need to even force it. And that's what's so interesting about the process is like when you're in the moment, it might seem like you are kind of making things happen. But when you zoom out and you look in the bigger picture, you realize that actually, no, actually, you basically were just remembering these things because you associated with people who taught them to you and you were thinking about them. It was just on your mind. And then you don't really have other things to think about because that's what was interesting to you. So it just kind of happens naturally. When you look at it in the bigger picture, when you kind of zoom out, you see how the patterns of your thinking, it's influenced by what you've heard and by what you're shown and by what you're taught and by what people do around you. So this is something to kind of remember that, yeah, you hear the Dhamma and then you'll naturally start implementing it, as many of you are already doing, right? You hear teachings on metta, and then when you start feeling aversion, you naturally start remembering, oh, I'm getting averse, as opposed to developing metta. You feel desire, and you remember, oh, I'm feeling greedy for something that I want, rather than being contented. You start getting upset that things change, or that people die, or that things don't go how you want, and you realize, oh, that's delusion. The nature of the world, the nature of life is to change and is to be disappointing, and so on, right? So these teachings, they kind of just naturally spring up in the mind and shift the attitude of the person who hears them towards the right direction, especially if they've come from inspiring examples, right? So that's the teaching of mindfulness, and that's the connection with the previous sutta. Other examples, by the way, of mindfulness as memory that are similar are, for example, remembering your good deeds, remembering the virtuous deeds that you've done, right? So that's an example of mindfulness, which is not the same as non-judgmental present moment awareness, right? Because let's say that you're remembering the good things that you've done, you're actually thinking of the past. But thinking of the past is not itself a problem. The problem is when the mind is carried away into the past in a way that's harmful, right? But thinking of the good things that you did in the past intentionally to develop joy in the present moment, that is not a harmful activity, and that is actually mindfulness, right? Or remembering the Buddhanusati, that's another form of mindfulness, and so on. So all these different practices that deal with remembering the Dhamma, remembering teachings and spiritual qualities, remembering inspiring examples in our life, that's all examples of mindfulness. And that's not something that we should be afraid of or concerned about. It's something that's actually encouraged by the Buddha. Okay, so then going through it a bit more quickly, because I don't want to just talk about mindfulness. The Buddha says here, as they live mindfully in this way, they investigate, explore, and inquire into that teaching with wisdom. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of investigation of principles. They develop it and perfect it. Okay, so this is the second awakening factor. So remember, there's 7. The first is mindfulness. And the second is translated here as investigation of principles. In Pali, the word is Dhamma Vicaya. And Vicaya means something like investigation, discernment, and Dhamma means teachings, principles, spiritual qualities. And so the Buddha is saying here that when you remember the teaching that you learned from inspiring people, then you naturally start to investigate and examine that in your experience. And that's called Dhamma Vicaya. So I actually already gave an example of this. It's kind of inseparable from mindfulness. So let's say, for example, again, just staying with something simple like metta. So you hear teachings on metta. If you never heard that teaching, it would not be possible to develop it, or if you never thought of it, at least, right? So you hear teachings on metta, and then you remember it. But then you start to look in your own mind and you see, okay, how do I develop metta? Do I have metta? Am I averse right now? Am I not averse? What is going, like, how does that happen? What do I need to do? When I do this, does it work, right? So for example, if I say, may all beings be happy, does that develop metta or does it not develop metta? If I think of certain people, does that help develop metta? So you start to remember the teaching, but then you also start to examine and investigate it in your own experience. And you start to learn not just the words, right? Not just the theory, but actually how does that apply to your experience right now, right here in this moment? How does it actually apply to you? And that's when you start to develop Dhamma Vicaya, the discernment of principles or of teachings. In one of the suttas, the Buddha defines this as the ability to differentiate between what is wholesome and unwholesome. So he says that Dhammavicaya is when you can know what's unwholesome and what's wholesome. So in your experience, I would say, right? So it's not, again, it's not just like you know the list of wholesome qualities, like you can name the 5 hindrances, but it's that when you look in your own mind, can you see something like greed and aversion? And can you see the opposite? Do you know what it feels like, the difference between those two? And also, do you know how they kind of arise and cease? Like, do you know how to develop um, contentment and kindness and how to get rid of aversion and greed? Do you know how that works in your experience, right? How do you get that knowledge? Well, you get it first from remembering the teachings with mindfulness and applying the instructions, and then by investigating those, right? That's called Dhammavicaya. So that's the second awakening factor. It can be very broad in the same way that mindfulness can be very broad, right? So just like mindfulness could include remembering teachings about how to develop metta, mindfulness can also include just simply developing metta, right? Just holding the feeling of metta in your mind. That's also mindfulness. And in the same way, Dhammavicaya, or investigation of principles, this can have many facets, many shades, right? Like on a course level, it would be almost discursive. Like you can almost ask yourself questions, kind of how does this work, or how does this happen, or am I doing something? Is this the right way to do this? And you kind of investigate in your heart, right? Again, it's not intellectual per se, but it's more using your intellect to develop emotional qualities and to understand how those work. So there's a course level, but then there's also a more subtle form of Dhammavicaya, which is just feeling how the meditation is progressing or not, right? Like when you're meditating, say, again, just because it's good to be consistent, say you're developing metta meditation. Say as you're developing metta, the metta starts to fall. It starts to weaken a little bit. Dhammavicaya is what recognizes that. Like it understands, oh, the metta is going down. Like something is stopping it here, but not necessarily verbally, right? You might just feel the difference. So this is where someone who's maybe not very experienced in meditation, they might spend like 30 minutes not even aware that they're thinking, right? They don't even know that they've lost the meditation, right? Whereas someone who's more developed in this ability, they start seeing, oh, my mind is slipping off because of this and that. So immediately you understand what's happening on the feeling level, and then you can deal with it correctly because you understand the causes, right? So that understanding of the different wholesome and unwholesome qualities in your mind and the different causes behind them, that's Dhammavicaya. And it, of course, comes from the mindfulness. It comes from hearing the teachings, applying them, reflecting on them, investigating them in your experience. So that's another example. And the example I gave of guided meditation is similar, right? When you have a guided meditation, I think most of us will know, sometimes the instructions are helpful, and sometimes the guided meditation instructions, they don't connect at that time, right? Like maybe someone tells you to do something in a guided meditation, but you find that it doesn't really work for you, right? Or it's not really happening how they're saying it, right? So in the same way, like the words of the guided meditation, bearing those in mind, that's the mindfulness. And then when you start to kind of feel like, okay, what do I need to do to make this applicable to me? How do I need to adapt these instructions to make it work for me? That's your Dhammavicaya. So you hear it, and then you investigate it and analyze it in your experience, and you start to understand it. And then it becomes more and more automatic as you develop and progress. And that's why the Buddha says that you gain the investigation, but then you also develop it, right? You don't, and then you perfect it ideally. So you don't just have it, but it's actually it's a scale. It's something that you develop. So yeah, again, with Dhammavicaya, this is something that we can look at as a cause. If our meditation is not going well, we can say, well, it's not because I'm not trying hard enough per se, but it's because I don't have enough wisdom, like experiential wisdom, to know what's happening, right? Because actually, if we really knew strongly the difference between wholesome and unwholesome, then the unwholesome wouldn't be able to survive very long, right? The problem is that the mind doesn't recognize unwholesome as unwholesome. It kind of thinks like, oh, well, this is beneficial for me. This is good for me, or it doesn't even know what it's doing, right? So I gave the example of in meditation, being overwhelmed by thoughts. and not even being aware of it. So that's an example of the mind just isn't even aware that the thoughts are a problem often at that point in time, right? Intellectually, you might have known it, but the mind doesn't actually fully understand that, right? So this is something that we can look at. We say, okay, it's not because I'm a good or bad meditator, but rather the causes are just missing, right? So it's like if it's very dry and then you get upset that your crops aren't growing and you think it's your fault, like you're a bad person. No, it's not your fault. It's just because it hasn't rained recently, right? So it's the same. Like just because your meditation isn't going well, it's not because you're a bad person. It's because you don't have enough of the causes aren't there, basically. And so then you just look, what are the causes that are missing? In this case, the cause might be Dhammavicca. It might be an experiential discernment and understanding of the wholesome and unwholesome qualities and how they're caused and arise and cease. And the Buddha says that comes from mindfulness. And the mindfulness comes from hearing the Dhamma, and hearing the Dhamma comes from being taught the Dhamma by inspiring teachers, right? So it's always this, we always go back to the sequence here. So you can just kind of examine this in terms of the previous cause that's missing in order to fulfill the following cause. Okay, Dhammavicca. And then the Buddha says, in the sutta, he says, as they investigate principles with wisdom in this way, their energy is roused up and unflagging. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of energy. They develop it and perfect it. So this is the third awakening factor called vidya, means translated here as energy. And here you can see, okay, the Buddha says that you remember the instructions or the Dhamma qualities, you investigate them in your experience, and then as you start to investigate and understand them, then you start getting you get energy roused up, and he says unflagging. So like very strong, persistent, steady energy. This is the quality of, at least in this context, right? Remembering that these qualities are broad. But in this context, what I think the Buddha is referring to is you might have times in your meditation where, well, actually, let me just take one step back. The reason I'm using meditation is because at the beginning of this, the Buddha said, when you are withdrawn in body and mind, and then he goes through the list, right? So he's talking about when you've gone off and basically you're meditating. So withdrawn in body and mind is really referring to meditation here. So just making that note that these awakening factors, you can develop them at all times, but really they're primarily referring to meditation, right? Primarily like formal meditation, that's when you're going to be developing these in any kind of serious, deep way, right? So yes, you can develop things like mindfulness and investigation all the time, and that's important. You shouldn't not do it, but you shouldn't expect your mindfulness while you're at the grocery store to be the same as when you're meditating on your own for a long period of time, right? It's not realistic. So we have to also remember that context. Like the Buddha, these are to be developed when we're secluded, like go off and find quiet time and develop them, meditate, and take the time, right? Allow it to progress naturally. So that's just a little footnote. That's why I'm referring to meditation, because the context for these is really as something that evolves organically and develops once you've gone off and are practicing on your own. Okay, so in terms of energy, the way that what I think the Buddha is referring to here is there are certain times when the meditation is biting and other times when it's not, right? And if you look at like what is going on there, I think often what's going on is the mind doesn't have the Dhammavicca, the investigation of qualities, clear enough, so it's not inspired to have energy. So using the example of the metta meditation, right? You remember the metta instructions, but if you can't really get that investigation going, like if you can't really find metta in your experience, then it's very hard to have energy to do metta meditation because it's not working, basically, right? Like you can't actually see how to get rid of the aversion or how to develop the metta. So if you don't have that wisdom of like how it actually goes, then you get stuck and you can't develop the meditation. But when you get that wisdom that sees, oh, this is the aversion. Oh, that's how it can be diminished. Oh, that's how the metta can be developed. That's what metta feels like. One of the aspects of the wisdom of wholesome and unwholesome is that wholesome qualities feel pleasant and unwholesome qualities have an unpleasant aspect to them. So especially something like aversion, it feels unpleasant, right? And metta feels pleasant. So once you get the investigation, the wisdom, the discernment in your experience of the aversion, how it works, how it's unpleasant, and you start to understand metta experientially and how it's pleasant, then you naturally get energy. It's like, oh, now I know what to do. Now I can actually do this. Now I can actually focus on the metta. Now I can actually develop this. Wow. And then you're inspired and you're mindful and you're aware and you want to keep meditating, right? So the meditation bites. So that's where the energy starts arising, and then it can develop and grow. So it's like that quality of interest, awareness, persistence, energy, really, right? It's just you're energized. You actually are interested and motivated to meditate. It's like a motivation. And so the energy is maintained by your ability to actually experience wholesome and unwholesome qualities and understand how they work. So that's when the meditation bites. And so then this is another thing that can be useful. It's like, okay, the Buddha is saying that energy is actually necessary for the meditation to move forward. So if that energy is missing, again, you look, how can I get more inspired? How can I get how can I feel the qualities that I'm trying to aim for? Another example would be breath meditation, by the way. So breath meditation, once you kind of can find the right way to stay with the breath, then you get the energy, right? You can actually stay there and you can develop it and you're motivated to do the breath meditation. But if you're kind of stuck, like you remember the instructions, the mindfulness is there of the breath, but like you can't really get your mind to stay with it. You can't really understand what's going on. You can't really clear away enough unwholesome qualities to do the meditation. Then the energy won't arise and the meditation will kind of be painful, and then the mind won't really leap forward to the meditation, right? So the energy, it actually comes from that investigation, that experiential understanding of wholesome and unwholesome. And then where does the energy lead? Well, the Buddha says, when they're energetic, rapture not of the flesh arises. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of rapture. They develop it and perfect it. Okay, so this quality is piti, translated here as rapture. There's other translations available, some things like joy, euphoria, delight, and basically any other kind of positive mental form of bright, elated happiness, right? So piti well, actually, maybe it will be useful if I continue and read on, because it continues actually here. So, okay, but it says when you're energetic, then this joy, this rapture, this euphoria, this happiness, not of the flesh, arises. And that's the awakening factor of rapture. And then he says, when the mind is full of rapture, the body and mind become tranquil. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of tranquility. They develop it and perfect it. Okay. So I put these two together because they kind of go together. So the Buddha says that the energy leads to a joy, not of the flesh. And then when your mind is full of that joy, then your body and your mind become tranquil. So piti, in other suttas, the Buddha talks about piti even in relation to sensual pleasures. Like the Buddha says that when someone really wants a sensual pleasure, like say an ice cream, say you really want an ice cream, and then you get it, then you're full of piti, like, yay, I got an ice cream, I'm so happy. So the Buddha, he says that's piti. Piti mano, the mind is piti, the mind is delighted, the mind is elated and joyful. So it's when your mind is happy. Piti is a mental reaction. It's like a mental form of rejoicing, joy, happiness, elation. Again, all these different words, rapture. It's when the mind is kind of filled with a joy. But in meditation, piti is referring to, as the Buddha says here, joy not of the flesh. So not because you get an ice cream or because you hear music or because you see something or because you feel something in your body or because you taste something or you think of like a memory of a beach or something like that. That can all cause piti, right? Piti can come from that, as the Buddha says. So you might even remember like, oh, I remember when I went to this concert with my friends and that was amazing. That was awesome. And you get so inspired and happy. But that's not the kind of piti that the Buddha is talking about per se, because that's the joy, the happiness, the elation, the rapture that's coming from sensual pleasures. It's coming from an experience of your body, of your five senses, right? So, but the Buddha is saying here it's piti, not of the flesh, that's coming from energy. So it's something in the mind. It's like when your mind is joyful and inspired because of the Dhamma, not because of essential experience. And that comes, the Buddha says, from the energy. And the energy comes from your awareness of wholesome qualities in your experience, which comes from mindfulness. So, as we've already discussed, right? So, the example of metta is, again, very easy. So, you hear about metta and you have certain instructions and you bear those in mind. Then you start to develop awareness of how to grow metta, how to remove the aversion, what it feels like to develop metta, what it feels like to remove aversion, and so on. You get that experiential awareness or experiential understanding of the actual meditation, not as information, but as practical experience. And then because of that, the meditation bites and you get the energy, you get the motivation, you get the ability to stay and meditate because you're actually interested in what you're doing. So then you're focused on the metta, you're doing the metta, you're developing it, right? You have that energy, you're actually interested. So then you start getting inspired and elated and joyful and happy because you're also moving away from the unwholesome qualities. So you feel contented and still, you feel kind and soft and gentle. You feel peaceful and not restless. You feel very aware and not sleepy. And you feel very clear about what you're doing. You're not doubting it because it's happening right there in your mind, right at the time. So the 5 hindrances are being diminished. And when those 5 hindrances are being diminished, then you start getting that joy, that inspiration, that elation, that euphoria that comes up in your mind. And the Buddha says that not of that euphoria, not of the flesh. He says when your mind is full of it, when you have piti mano, so your mind has piti, has rapture, then the body and the mind become tranquil. So your body settles down and your mind also settles down. And that's the 5th awakening factor. So piti is the 4th, rapture is the 4th, tranquility is the 5th. And I think that people will have experienced this even just in daily life. Like, let's say, just remember a time that you were very happy. Probably at that time, you weren't really focused on like discomforts in your body. Because when you're happy, the kind of awareness of your body and that sort of, your body is not, it's not kind of agitating your mind. You see what I mean? It's just not really something that's occupying you, like you're concerned about it or your body is tense. You're not aware of that when you're very happy, usually. Of course, there can be exceptions. But when the mind is very inspired, very elated, very joyful, the body is not all tense and tight and distracting you because your mind is actually, the awareness is occupied by something better. It's occupied by something that's calling your attention stronger. And this is just a natural factor of the mind. So when the mind is experiencing pleasure, it naturally goes towards that experience, right? Like, let's say that you're engrossed in a TV program, you might not even hear someone knocking on the door, or you might not even hear someone coming into the room. Actually, interestingly, I heard a story, apparently this is a real story, of a couple who were watching TV, and they were sitting on the couch watching TV, and they were loving it, and then at a certain point, they realized that someone had come into their house and stolen a bunch of stuff while they were actually in the living room. They actually came into the same room and started stealing things in their house and had left already, but they were so focused on the TV that they didn't even hear it. So when the mind is enraptured, when it's kind of really interested and inspired and elated about something, even something very mundane like TV, right? That's not the same level that we're talking about. Even something like that, the attention is drawn towards it. It's drawn away from other things, especially the body. Another example would be when you're watching TV, you're not aware of what your body feels like because you're not paying attention to it and because your mind is experiencing joy in relation to something else. So the tension of the body, like the distracting pull of the body, is removed when the mind is inspired and happy and elated and euphoric. And the body is just relaxed naturally. And this is also something that can actually be developed intentionally. Like some people might intentionally develop a sort of peace and joy in order to help relax their body, right? So these are different things that go together, like the relationship of the joy in your mind and then the relaxation in your body, they seem kind of separate, but actually, if you just examine your experience, you see, oh yeah, it's very true. The mind, when it's happy, it doesn't really focus on tensions and tightness and irrelevant sensations in the body. And the same thing is true of the mind. So when the mind is very joyful and happy, it's also not restless and agitated. So the piti, the euphoria, the joy, the elation, the inspiration, it also relaxes your mind because it gives you a stable, pleasant, peaceful, well, maybe peaceful is not the right word in this. It's peaceful, but it gives you a stable, pleasant, clear, and engaging object of awareness, right? So the example of metta, like if you have a clear feeling of metta, a joyful, beautiful feeling of metta, your body will be relaxed. It will not be pulling on your attention. And also your mind will be relaxed because agitating, disturbing thoughts, they just don't really have the chance to arise. Because similarly, agitating, disturbing thoughts or restless emotions and so on, they come from the mind seeking happiness. But if the mind is being sustained and nourished by a very pleasant happiness, then it doesn't search for happiness, right? You're happy where you are. So that's how piti leads to tranquility of the body and of the mind. That joy and that inspiration leads to tranquility. And this is, again, something that's also very useful because the Buddha is pointing out here how it's a cause and effect sequence. Like when you say in meditation, it's very common that people will, after a certain amount of time, their body will just be really uncomfortable and they don't want to keep sitting in meditation. And the Buddha says that the way to be tranquil in your body is to have joy, right? So whenever the Buddha talks about meditation and when he talks about developing these qualities, he's talking about it almost always from the angle of gradually developing brighter and brighter happiness, right? From something that's very positive. Like meditation is a positive experience, right? In the suttas, when the Buddha talks about it, he's talking about something positive. He never talks about it as something sort of grueling and horrible. I don't know of a single place where he says that. There's one place where he says that sometimes you have to endure pain because it will lead to wholesome qualities. But he very rarely says that. It's not something that's a kind of a common theme. So meditation is something that's supposed to be pleasant, because if it's not pleasant, again, not necessarily like amazingly pleasant from the very beginning, but if it's not generally kind of relatively smooth and pleasant, then something is going wrong, right? Either you're kind of forcing it in a way that's not necessary, or you haven't developed a sufficient base and things like virtue and restraint. Like too much defilement is kind of on the mind already, so it's not able to be peaceful. Or you don't know what to do. Basically, you don't have clear instructions, right? And all of these things we've addressed. So hearing the true teaching and remembering that's the instructions, removing the defilements with your sila and your sense restraint and your mindfulness in daily life. That's, again, how you develop that basis. And then not forcing it is, again, something that I've talked about. So not like getting restless about your progress or kind of wishing it was going quicker than it was and so on. That's another misunderstanding. So all of those obstacles to meditation, when those are removed, really the meditation it shouldn't be grueling. It shouldn't be horrible, right? It should be something that's relatively pleasant and that only gets better as it's practiced well. Always allowing for room for ups and downs, right? Always allowing that, okay, sometimes it's going to go smoother. Sometimes it's going to go rougher. Sometimes there'll be just periods where it's a bit harder. That's all natural. That's all normal. But as a general principle, if the meditation is like consistently grueling, horrible, boring, uninteresting, painful, forced, then it's not the meditation. Something is wrong there. Something is the causes are not right, right? So then you just kind of take the step back and you say like, oh, it's not personal. It's just cause and effect. Just basic nature that's not aligned, right? Like I said before, if the crops aren't growing, if the field is dry, you just say, okay, maybe they need watered, right? You don't start flogging yourself or say, I can't do this and quit. No, you just look, okay, what is missing then? Okay, maybe the field just needs watered. It's very simple. Nothing to be upset about, right? Nothing to be kind of worried about, really. It's just natural. And so in the same way with the mind and with meditation. So why did I get into this? Because of the tranquility, right? Because when the body is very restless, agitated, tense, if you're just constantly sitting through that, it's not necessarily going to be the best way, right? Because if you develop the joy, that naturally develops tranquility. So you kind of have to look like, when is the right time for which? Sometimes you might have to endure, and other times you might have to say, I'm not doing the right thing. I'm not developing joy. I'm developing the opposite. And you need to kind of adjust the way that the meditation is developing, right? And if you don't know how to develop joy, then again, you look at the previous causes. You go back to the energy, the investigation, the mindfulness, and the association with examples and teachings. And okay, so then we're approaching the last awakening factors. So once you have the tranquility, then the Buddha says, I don't know if I read this part here. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of tranquility. They develop it and perfect it. And just again, emphasizing that these are things that they arise, but they also have to be developed. So tranquility is not just on or off, right? So tranquility, it can start as just relaxation in your body, but it can actually develop and develop and develop. And then you might actually have, one of the aspects of tranquility is that the activity, the diversity of sense objects should be reducing, right? Thoughts and sense objects. So say you're focusing on metta, then if you have many different objects coming up in your mind, that is a sign that the tranquility is not very high. Because tranquility is related to things fading from the attention, basically, right? Fading away from being poles, being kind of rocks that are kind of blocking the mind, right? So tranquility leads towards unification. And this is how the Buddha says that happens. He says, when the body is tranquil and one feels bliss, the mind becomes unified in samadhi. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of samadhi. They develop it and perfect it. So in the 7 awakening factors, after the factor of tranquility, passaddhi, is the factor of samadhi. But in many other sequences in the suttas, the Buddha has, after passaddhi, after tranquility, specifically of the body, and usually he emphasizes tranquility of the body here, like the body becoming less of an object of awareness and focusing more on the joy in the mind. Then he often includes sukha, which means bliss, ease, happiness, pleasure. Bhante Sujato here translates it as bliss. And in the 7 awakening factors, although sukha is not actually one of the 7, you can see in the sutta the Buddha includes it here. And I don't think it's worth spending too much time wondering why it's not included. But briefly, I think that one of the reasons is because for some reason the Buddha felt that the number 7 was useful here. There are suttas in the Bojjhanga Samyutta where the Buddha connects the 7 awakening factors to the 7 treasures of a wheel-turning monarch. And 7 is often an auspicious number in the suttas. So I suspect that for some reason or another, the Buddha he felt that 7 was a useful number at this point. And so he includes sukha in the description, but he doesn't actually include it as an official factor, right? So he says, when the body is tranquil and one feels bliss, then the mind becomes immersed, unified in samadhi. And so the connection here is not explained in detail, but it is mentioned in many, many places in the suttas. The Buddha says that when he says pasadakayo sukhang vedyati, so when the body is tranquilized, the mind, then one feels bliss, one feels ease, one feels pleasure. And again, I think this is something that even just on a mundane level, one can understand. Like when one is really relaxed and one is really just happy and just you're really joyful and happy where you are and everything relaxes, it gives you this ease, like blissful feeling, right? It's just blissful. It's an easeful relaxation into like a water of still, a water of peace, a water of joy, of ease, right? And it's not quite the same because the Buddha says that, at least it's implied in the way that the words are used, and this is also how it's understood in the tradition, that piti is a mental reaction and sukha is more of like a bare feeling. So piti is when the mind is kind of almost responding with joy and elation and inspiration and happiness. The mind is like reacting with that joy. And the sukha, is like a base ease, blissful pleasure that's almost like pervading your experience that you're resting in. So it's a little bit different. It's more almost like stable and peaceful, but it's also a form of pleasure. It's not just it's not like a dull peace or something like that. So the difference between piti and sukha is something that really can only really be understood when someone attains the third jhana. So which is really quite an advanced state of meditation. So like some people, like for example, Ajahn Brahm, one of the teachers, one of his recommendations is don't even try to differentiate them very much, because they're always intermingled until you get to the third jhana. And I think that seems like a practical instruction. Like you don't really need to try to label in your mind, like, is this piti? Is this sukha? Is this pamoja? Is this pasadi? Right? If you're kind of labeling and assessing the experience in that way, then it's an obstacle, because the mind it's no longer peaceful. It's agitated, right? And it also has the hindrance of doubt, which is like, what is going on? What is this? Is this? Is this that? So trying to kind of analyze too much during the meditation is a hindrance. But as far as the list goes, I would say that the Buddha is differentiating between joy and elation and inspiration, and more of like a pleasant bliss and ease that comes from tranquility. Because once the mind and the body are tranquil, then you can just kind of settle into bliss, settle into pleasure, which will include the piti, right? So it's a product of the relaxation. It's a product of the simplicity, of the unification. And because things are becoming tranquil, so you have less pulls on your attention, and your mind is relaxed, so it just rests in a blissful pleasure. Then the Buddha says that leads to the mind unifying in samadhi, which is when essentially the mind is no longer moving about, right? It's no longer differentiating between different things, and it's just resting. And then again, samadhi, he says they develop it and perfect it. So there's different ways of understanding that. Deep samadhi would be the jhanas. And usually when the Buddha talks about samadhi, he's referring to the jhanas. But even before that stage, then of course you can have you can develop simplicity and unity of mind, right? So even just taking, for example, the breath or metta, already that's a form of kind of unifying the mind on a single theme. And then you can even develop from there, right? So you might have awareness of the metta, but you can still have different distractions like sounds and body feelings and so on. But as you progress, and as the metta becomes more joyful, more inspiring, everything relaxes, it becomes more blissful, then your mind will start to naturally just go on to a single awareness of metta without other objects kind of invading the mind, right? So the factor of samadhi is not to be seen per se as just like a single thing, as a black or white. But usually when the Buddha is talking about samadhi, he's mostly talking about the jhanas in these official contexts, these kind of doctrinal contexts. And certainly that would be included in developing and perfecting it. And so then he says, they closely watch over that mind unified in samadhi. At such a time, a mendicant has activated the awakening factor of equanimity. They develop it and perfect it. And that's the last awakening factor. That's the awakening factor of upekkha, or equanimity. And upekkha literally means something like looking on. So it is interesting, because although upekkha is often translated as equanimity, in contexts such as this, which you see in the sutta and other suttas, upekkha almost seems like the Buddha is really emphasizing the aspect of it of observing. So here he defines it as they closely watch over their mind unified in samadhi. So the word here being ajupekkita, which is just another form of the word upekka. So what does that mean? Well, there's another sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya 5s where the Buddha says that there are 5 factors to right samadhi. And he says, well, basically they're the 4 jhanas. And then the 5th one, he says, is when someone then review a jhana. So he says that you have someone might attain the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, or the 4th jhana. And then the 5th factor of right samadhi, the Buddha says, is when they then look back on that experience and they review it. And he says it's like someone who's standing looks at someone who's sitting, or someone who's sitting looks at someone who's lying down. So the point there is that once they emerge from the jhana, then they review it, just like someone who's standing looks at someone in a more still posture. So the mind, once it kind of reviews back on the experience, then it's like a standing person looking at a sitting person. And he says that that's also a factor of samadhi. So it seems that when he's talking about upekkha as an awakening factor here, he's saying that they then review the mind with equanimity. So they then they review that experience of samadhi with a clear, peaceful, still awareness of what happened. And in the Anapanasati Sutta, the Buddha actually connects this to insight practice. So it's interesting because he says that the stage of Anapanasati where someone contemplates impermanence, if you don't know this, don't worry, it's nothing crucial. But if you're familiar with the sutta, then the Buddha says that after someone develops the jhana, so he says freeing the mind, which is a term for the jhanas, after they develop the jhanas, then they contemplate impermanence, they contemplate dispassion or fading, different ways of looking at it, cessation, and relinquishment. And he likens this to he kind of compares this to equanimity. And it seems if you look at the awakening factors, then it kind of becomes a bit more clear how he kind of connects this, where once they've attained the jhana, then they look back on it and they review their experience in terms of, for example, anicca, impermanence. So they look back and they reflect on the experience peacefully, equanimously, in terms of impermanence, rather than say someone attains a jhana and then they kind of get excited. They start thinking, oh, that they're wonderful, or they're more powerful than other people, or they get carried away with some other distracting thoughts. Rather, the Buddha says, no, you should then develop equanimity, review the experience with equanimity, and just observe it in terms of, for example, the three characteristics. And that's how you develop wisdom. And that's what eventually leads to awakening. So I think that when the Buddha puts the last factor of equanimity in the awakening factors here, he's especially referring to like a very deep form of equanimity, not just, you're equanimous towards the noises on the street or something. And he's really talking about, you emerge from jhana, maybe possibly even a fourth jhana, and then you're kind of reviewing the mind in terms of the three characteristics. So it's something very deep, right? Very profound. It's not something just kind of superficial, but it is a quality that, like all the awakening factors, is not exclusive of equanimity in normal daily context. And so the factor of equanimity includes, of course, developing non-reactive awareness, you could say even non-judgmental, in the sense of not judging with desire and aversion to your sense experience, for example. So that's also included in equanimity. So equanimity is a broad factor, but here in this context, it seems to be referring to something very deep, something that happens after deep meditation, and that's why it's the last factor here. And that's the end of the 7 awakening factors. And then what the Buddha says in the sutta is, when the 7 awakening factors are developed and cultivated in this way, the person practicing them can expect 7 fruits and benefits. And he says here, they attain enlightenment early on in this very life. If not, they attain enlightenment at the time of death. If not, with the ending of the 5 lower fetters, they're extinguished between one life and the next. If not, with the ending of the 5 lower fetters, they're extinguished upon landing. If not, with the ending of the 5 lower fetters, they're extinguished without extra effort. If not, with the ending of the 5 lower fetters, they're extinguished with extra effort. If not, with the ending of the 5 lower fetters, they head upstream, going to the Akanita realm. When the 7 awakening factors are developed and cultivated in this way, these are the 7 fruits and benefits they can expect. And I rushed through that a bit quickly because the main message here that the Buddha is saying is that someone who develops the 7 awakening factors will either attain awakening or they'll become a non-returner. And he just gives a list of different types of non-returners. So what a non-returner is someone who is almost awakened, but they still have subtle defilements left, which prevent them from attaining awakening in their very lifetime, but they're destined to attain enlightenment very shortly after. And there's different types. it's not really particularly relevant, but just for the sake of, because we're reading the sutta, very quickly, someone who's extinguished between one life and the next is someone who, after they die, but before they get reborn, uh, they they immediately attain awakening, and then they're not reborn. So they immediately cease to be reborn. They immediately cease samsara between lives. And then there's people who, as soon as they get reborn, they attain awakening, or people who they get reborn and then without any effort, just kind of naturally, they just attain awakening. Some people have to put forth a bit of effort. Okay, hello everyone. Sorry about that. There was a technical difficulty, and it looks like the internet cut out here. So I think that since we covered most of the sutta, and I'll have to be going with the timing here, then we can close for now. And I apologize about we don't want to have any time for questions. But if you do have any questions, then of course you could always leave those for Monk Chat. There should be a Monk Chat on Friday, tomorrow. And so you're welcome to do that instead of leaving them on today's live stream. And of course, in any future live streams with any of the monastics, please feel free to leave questions there. So apologies for the inconvenience and the internet problems. I hope that the sutta was useful for all of you. And at this time, we can close with 3 sadhus and end the live stream. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Have a wonderful rest of your day.